London, 1854. The bells of St. Albans Chapel tolled like slow, solemn confessions, their sound rippling across the city's grey rooftops and narrow, rain-slicked streets. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax, of sanctity and scrutiny. Nobility filled the pews in glittering ranks, duchesses and countesses whispering behind feathered fans, gentlemen shifting in polished boots, their eyes hungry for spectacle. They had not gathered for love but for scandal's quiet feast. At the altar stood Eleanor Whitcomb, daughter of a merchant whose fortune had risen faster than his manners. She looked fragile but not small, her gloved hands trembling beneath the weight of lace and expectation. Her gown, ivory satin, heavy with pearls, had been loaned from the Queen's own seamstress, yet its beauty felt borrowed, undeserved. Her heart thudded not with joy but with dread. Every glance from the congregation was a reminder that she was the outsider who had somehow ensnared England's most elusive nobleman. Opposite her stood Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ashbourne. He was tall, composed, his face carved in the restraint expected of his rank. The candlelight traced his sharp jaw and the faint lines beneath his eyes, suggesting sleepless years rather than age. His attire was impeccable, black velvet coat, silver-stitched cuffs, a white cravat tied with military precision. Yet for all his elegance, there was something hollow in his gaze, as though the world beyond the chapel had long ceased to touch him. The priest's voice droned like distant thunder. Words of unity and obedience filled the air, sanctifying a bond neither heart had chosen. Eleanor stole a glance at her groom, hoping to find reassurance, even a flicker of warmth. Instead, she met a man locked in some private storm. His eyes never settled on her face but fixed somewhere beyond, perhaps upon a memory. When the priest invited the groom to speak his vows, Alexander's tone was steady, detached, a voice that might have been reciting law, not love. "I take thee, Eleanor Whitcomb, to be my lawful wedded wife." The congregation sighed at the sound of his baritone, mistaking composure for passion. Eleanor's voice followed, soft but resolute, her syllables trembling like glass under pressure. As the final blessing fell from the priest's lips, the church seemed to exhale. The organ swelled. Petals fell from the balcony. The Duke turned to his bride, took her gloved hand, and leaned close enough for her to feel his breath against her ear. "You'll spend the wedding night alone," he murmured. The words were so quiet they might have been mistaken for tenderness, yet their chill struck deeper than any shout. Eleanor's fingers froze in his grasp. For a heartbeat, she thought she had misheard. But the distance in his eyes confirmed it. She smiled faintly, an act of self-preservation more than grace, and allowed him to lead her down the aisle. Every head turned, every whisper sharpened into a blade. "Alone," someone murmured. "Already." The laughter was soft, poisonous. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, steady and dignified, like a curtain closing upon a farce. The Duke's carriage waited, black as morning. When he helped her inside, his touch was formal, his words perfunctory. "You needn't fear the journey. It's but an hour to Ashbourne." Then he turned to the window, the reflection of his face fractured by the raindrops. Eleanor sat across from him, her pulse loud in the quiet. She studied the man who was now her husband. The stillness of his hands, the faint scar near his temple, the way his eyes softened, briefly, when he gazed at the passing rain. Beneath the stoicism, she sensed sorrow, not cruelty. Something in him was broken, and whatever had shattered him had not yet mended. The carriage rattled through the cobblestone streets, carrying them past onlookers who bowed to the new duchess. She felt none of the triumph she was supposed to feel. The title tasted like ash. She imagined what they whispered as the carriage passed, that she had bought her crown with her father's fortune, that her beauty was plain, that the Duke's proposal had come too swiftly after his last heartbreak. At last, unable to bear the silence, she spoke. "Your Grace," she began, her tone measured, "I know ours was not a union of affection, but perhaps, in time—" "Time," he interrupted softly, without turning his head. "Time cannot alter what is already buried." The words hung between them, heavy and final. She lowered her eyes, twisting her wedding ring as if it might answer for him. The road stretched on, the wheels humming a rhythm that seemed to echo his detachment. When they arrived at Ashbourne Manor, the grandeur of the estate struck her speechless. It loomed over the countryside, a labyrinth of stone and shadow, its windows lit like watchful eyes. The servants lined the steps, their faces schooled into politeness. The Duchess curtsied, her smile fragile, while the Duke ascended the steps without pause. Inside, the air smelled of oak and cold marble, the remnants of a fire long extinguished. In the drawing-room, portraits of solemn ancestors stared down, each bearing the same hawthorn eyes, proud, distant, unyielding. One, a woman in crimson silk, caught Eleanor's attention. There was something hauntingly familiar about her expression. She turned toward the Duke, hoping to ask who the lady was, but his gaze had drifted toward the hearth, as if he saw a ghost where there was none. Dinner passed in silence. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, the silverware clinked softly. She tried again to bridge the space between them. "You have a beautiful home," she said gently. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a moment she thought she saw sorrow flicker in his eyes. "It was my mother's," he replied. She believed these halls could warm even the coldest souls. His mouth curved into something almost like a smile. She was mistaken. Afterward, he excused himself with a courteous bow and disappeared down a corridor. The echo of his footsteps faded, leaving her alone amid the splendor that felt more like exile than luxury. She wandered the halls until she found herself before a locked door at the end of the west wing. The handle was ornate, its brass dulled by time. She reached out, hesitated, and withdrew her hand. Some doors, she sensed, were meant to stay closed, at least for now. Later, as she stood by the window of her chamber, the manor slept under a restless sky. Rain traced silver threads down the glass, and somewhere in the distance, an owl cried. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the echo of his whisper, "You'll spend the wedding night alone." He had spoken it not as cruelty, but as confession. In that quiet, Eleanor understood something she could not yet name, an intuition that the Duke's heart was not hers to win, not yet. It belonged to another time, another promise. Yet despite the humiliation, despite the ache that filled her chest, she did not weep. She stood straighter, watching the first faint light of dawn bleed across the horizon. Tomorrow, she vowed, she would begin to learn what kind of ghost shared her husband's shadow, and whether love could ever reach a man who no longer believed himself capable of it. The days that followed the wedding were filled with silence. Not the peaceful sort, but the kind that crept through corridors and lingered at the edges of every conversation. Ashbourne Manor stood vast and echoing, its marble halls and oil portraits offering more company than its master. Eleanor quickly learned the rhythm of the household. The Duke breakfasted early, rode out before noon, dined late, and retired to the west wing where she was not welcome. They crossed paths only at formal hours, exchanging polite words that meant nothing. To the staff, she was the Duchess of Ashbourne, mistress of the house. To herself, she felt more like its most honored prisoner. The first scandal came swiftly. Newspapers in London printed elegant caricatures of their wedding, the ink still wet with speculation. "The merchant's daughter who became a duchess," one headline declared, followed by cruel jests about how gold could purchase any heart, even one as cold as the Duke's. At luncheons, ladies of the court pretended sympathy while trading gossip behind lace fans. Eleanor's every gesture, every gown, became a subject of dissection. Yet she met them all with dignity, holding her chin high, the perfect imitation of a noblewoman who felt nothing. When the Duke did appear, it was always with that same unreadable calm. One evening, she found a small parcel left upon her writing desk, an antique book of poetry bound in navy leather, its pages well thumbed, the Duke's name faintly inked on the first page. No note accompanied it. She traced his signature with her fingertip, wondering whether it was an apology, a duty, or a moment of weakness. That night she placed it beside her bed, though she did not yet dare to hope. Weeks passed. The manor became both sanctuary and labyrinth. Eleanor took to exploring its endless corridors, accompanied only by the faint echo of her own footsteps. In the music room, a pianoforte sat untouched beneath a white sheet. In the library, dust lay thick over volumes of law, history, and forgotten romance. Every corner seemed haunted by stillness, as though the walls themselves remembered laughter that had long since died. During one of her walks, she met Mrs. Penrose, the housekeeper, a thin, silver-haired woman who spoke rarely and bowed deeply. "His Grace prefers quiet," she said, when Eleanor asked why the west wing was closed. "That part of the house is not for guests." Eleanor heard the unspoken warning in her tone and did not press further. But curiosity, once sparked, is not easily extinguished. One evening, during a dinner for neighboring nobility, the silence broke in the most public of ways. A baron's wife, well fed on wine and malice, remarked loudly, "It said the Duke weds one woman but mourns another." A tragedy, truly, but then, some men never recover from first love. The table fell still. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she met the woman's gaze with cool precision. "If he mourns, madam, it speaks only of his capacity to love deeply. I shall not fault him for that." The Baroness laughed lightly, but the Duke, who had remained silent throughout, set down his glass and rose. "That will be the last remark made at my table about matters you cannot comprehend," he said, his tone courteous but edged with finality. Then, without another word, he left the room. The guests departed early that night, and the servants whispered for days. Eleanor found herself both humiliated and intrigued. The scandal she dismissed as gossip now bore the weight of truth. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered to the west wing. Moonlight fell through tall windows, illuminating the dust in pale silver strands. At the end of the corridor stood a locked door, the same one she had once dared to touch. She placed her ear against it and heard faint music, a melody played softly on the pianoforte. A man's voice, her husband's, murmured words she could not catch. Her heart stuttered. The following morning, he was gone before breakfast, leaving only another token behind, a single white rose laid atop the book of poetry. Its petals were fresh, dewy, cut that morning. She stared at it for a long while before placing it in a crystal vase by her bedside. That small gesture, so strangely tender, deepened rather than eased the ache between them. As spring turned to summer, London's season began, and invitations poured in. The Queen's court expected their presence at a ball, but the Duke declined each one without consultation. "We have no need of appearances," he said, when she asked. "Society feeds on appearances," she replied quietly. "And it is appearances that protect us." He paused, studying her face with something almost like admiration. "Perhaps you are wiser than I thought." But still, he did not attend. One afternoon, while the house slept under heavy rain, Eleanor returned to the west wing. This time, the door was ajar. She hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The room was a private study, shelves lined with books, a pianoforte in the corner, and near the window, a portrait draped in silk. She drew the cloth aside and gasped. The woman's likeness was striking. Chestnut hair, pale eyes, the faintest smile playing on her lips. She could have been Eleanor's reflection, save for the confidence in her expression. A plaque beneath the frame bore the name Lady Beatrice Langford. She had heard the name whispered once at a dinner but dismissed it as rumor. Now she felt the truth in her bones. Beatrice, whoever she was, had been loved deeply, painted as if by reverence itself. On the desk below lay a glass case containing a letter, its paper stained dark at the edges, and beside it, a simple gold ring engraved with the initials BL. A floorboard creaked behind her. "You should not be here," the Duke said quietly. She turned, startled. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, for once, were alive, with anger, with grief, she could not tell. "I meant no disrespect," she managed. "I sought only to understand." He stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might shout, but his voice came out hoarse. "Understanding can wound as deeply as ignorance, Duchess." Then, softer, almost to himself, "She was the one thing I could not protect." He turned away, leaving her amid the ghosts he refused to name. Eleanor stood motionless, her pulse trembling in her throat. She looked once more at the portrait, the serene smile, the ring, the evidence of love that refused to die, and understood the quiet cruelty of her marriage. It was not indifference she faced, but devotion misplaced in memory. That night, thunder rolled across the moors, and lightning flashed over the manor's spires. From her chamber, Eleanor watched the west wing's windows flicker with candlelight. Somewhere behind those walls, the Duke's shadow moved, pacing before the ghost of a woman long gone. She pressed her palm to the cold glass, whispering into the storm, What kind of love leaves no room for the living? The question went unanswered, but something within her shifted, a determination she did not yet know she possessed. If the Duke of Ashbourne was haunted, she would learn the name of his ghost and face it. For only then could she decide whether her heart would remain chained to his silence or find freedom beyond it. The rain fell harder, relentless against the stone, as though the heavens themselves mourned what neither of them could yet say aloud. Rain came softly to Ashbourne Hall that night, tracing silver threads down the tall arched windows as the house slept in uneasy quiet. The fire in the Duke's private study had long gone to embers, yet he sat still before it, hands clasped, gaze fixed on the ghostly shimmer of dying coals. His reflection in the dark glass seemed older than his years, 30, yet burdened by a grief that time refused to bury. Upstairs, in the bedchamber prepared for a wife he had not touched, Eleanor lay awake, her eyes wide open to the velvet dark, listening to the rain like an unanswered question. The words he had whispered at the altar still rang in her heart, "You'll spend the wedding night alone." But solitude had never frightened her as much as mystery did. Days passed, and with them came whispers, of a duke who would not touch his bride, of a union sealed in ice rather than affection. London's drawing-rooms gleamed with curiosity, and the name Eleanor Whitcomb floated from fan to fan like a sweet scandal. Yet within the walls of Ashbourne Hall, an invisible thread began to draw them nearer, not through desire, but through curiosity and restraint. The Duke was courteous, even kind, though his smile never reached his eyes. He dined with her under candlelight but spoke little. He would rise from table at the first hint of intimacy, leaving her with unfinished sentences and a hollow ache she could not name. It was not until she wandered the east wing, an abandoned part of the estate draped in dust and forgotten light, that she found the truth's first shadow. Behind a locked door, she heard the faint strains of a woman's lullaby, played upon a piano out of tune. The sound was tender, heartbreakingly so, as if someone had left their sorrow behind and it still echoed in the wood. When she asked a maid about it, the woman paled and crossed herself. "That wing has been closed since her Grace's death," she whispered. Eleanor said no more, but that night she dreamed of a woman in white, standing by a cradle, her face turned away. Her curiosity became her rebellion. Each day she ventured farther, through gardens choked in ivy, through libraries layered in dust. She learned of the Duke's late wife, Lady Cecilia Ravenshade, a beauty once painted for the Queen herself, who had died in childbirth 3 winters past. And the child? Gone too, they said. The story was always told in fragments, as if the truth had been divided and scattered across the estate. But it was the look in the Duke's eyes, the faint tremor in his voice when her name was mentioned, that told Eleanor more than gossip ever could. One evening, she came upon him in the chapel, alone, kneeling before the altar, the candlelight gilding his bowed head. He did not hear her enter. "Forgive me," he murmured into the silence, "for I have kept her memory like a vow." The words fell like a blade upon Eleanor's heart, yet she made no sound. She turned and fled before his gaze could find hers. From that night on, she kept her distance, not out of anger, but out of understanding. He was not cruel. He was faithful to a ghost. But love, once awakened, is not easily buried. The Duke began to notice her absence, the quiet of the breakfast table, the empty chair in the library where she once read. When she passed him in the corridor, he found himself watching, as though the mere movement of her hand through lamplight stirred something long dormant in him. One afternoon, as a storm raged outside, she stood by the window, painting. He entered unannounced, and for the first time, she did not rise. Instead, she said softly, "I did not wish to disturb you, Your Grace." "Eleanor," he said, her name catching in his throat like confession. "You are my wife. You disturb nothing that is not already broken." The thunder rolled, low and distant. She turned to him, eyes shining. "Then let me mend it." The silence that followed was not cold but heavy with unspoken longing. He moved closer, hesitant as a man crossing sacred ground. His hand brushed the sleeve of her gown, and for a moment the air seemed to breathe between them. Yet before the distance could vanish, the Duke stepped back, his voice a whisper of defeat. "You do not know what you ask." That night Eleanor wept, not for herself, but for him. For a man bound to duty, shadowed by guilt, and haunted by the tender cruelty of memory. But grief, like ivy, will find its way through stone. Days later, she sent for the key to the east wing. She entered alone, guided by candlelight and courage. Dust motes shimmered like ghosts as she crossed the threshold. Within, she found the remnants of a nursery, a small cradle draped in white lace, and beside it, a painting of the Duke holding a child, his expression raw, almost unrecognizable. Beneath it, she found a locket, tarnished with time, containing 2 locks of hair, one golden, one brown. She fell to her knees, understanding at last. When he found her there, tears marked his face before words did. "You should not be here," he said, but the anger in his tone was laced with sorrow. "I had to see," she whispered. "I had to know what held you captive." He sank beside her, the candlelight trembling between them. "I loved her," he confessed, voice breaking. "But it was not love that destroyed her, it was me. I sent her to London when she begged to stay. She died bringing my son into this world, and neither of them returned. I buried them both and swore I would never again call something mine." Eleanor reached for his hand, her touch steady and warm. "You did not kill them, William. You only loved them, and could not forgive yourself for surviving." For the first time, he looked at her not as a reminder of duty but as a possibility of mercy. The weight of years seemed to lift from his shoulders. He closed his eyes, as though the simple act of her hand in his could rewrite the cruel arithmetic of loss. That night, he did not leave her alone. He did not kiss her, nor speak of passion, but he sat beside her until dawn, their hands entwined as the rain washed against the windows. It was not the love of ballads or scandal, but something quieter, like forgiveness finding its voice. In the weeks that followed, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne began to walk the gardens together, their silences no longer empty. The townspeople still whispered, but their words no longer wounded. The chapel bell rang again that spring, not for a wedding nor a funeral, but for a christening, the start of something neither of them had dared to hope for. And though history would remember him as the handsome Duke and her as the common bride who softened his heart, the truth was simpler. She had loved him not for who he had been, but for who he still wished to become. And in that quiet redemption, the ghosts of Ashbourne finally slept.